I think I think it's time to return back home.
Debby thought the worst thing she could discover was proof that Mido had been quietly planning his American future without her. But when she finally came home ready to confront him, she found something far more disturbing waiting inside that house. Because Mido was gone, his suitcase had disappeared, his passport and important documents were missing, his phone was unreachable, and the only thing he had left behind was a short message asking her not to come looking for him. What terrified Debby was not simply the fact that Mido had walked away, because people leave relationships every day after fights and heartbreak. But this departure looked too organized, too clean, and too perfectly timed to feel like an emotional decision made in the heat of the moment. Only hours earlier, Debby had discovered paperwork that made her question whether Mido's immigration future had been occupying far more of his attention than the future of their relationship. And now the man who could explain everything had disappeared before she could ask him a single question. At first, Debby refuses to jump to the darkest conclusion, because she knows exactly how bad the situation looks. And she also knows that fear can make ordinary details appear suspicious. She calls Mido repeatedly, hoping he will answer and tell her he simply needed space, but every call goes unanswered while the silence inside the house becomes more uncomfortable. She walks into the bedroom and immediately notices the empty space where Mido normally kept his travel bag. Then she checks the drawers and discovers something even stranger, because he has not taken everything. Plenty of clothes remain behind, several personal items are untouched, and the room does not look like somebody angrily threw his entire life into a suitcase after one terrible argument. Instead, Mido appears to have taken only what somebody would need if that person already knew exactly where he was going. His passport is missing, a folder containing important paperwork is gone, several chargers have disappeared, and the pair of shoes he normally wears when traveling is nowhere in the room. Debby stands there looking at everything he left behind and realizes that the abandoned belongings are almost more revealing than the missing ones. Because an impulsive exit normally creates chaos, while this feels selective. Someone seems to have decided what mattered, what could be abandoned, and what absolutely had to leave with him. Which immediately raises the question Debby cannot stop thinking about. If Mido made this decision only after realizing their relationship was in trouble, how did he manage to organize everything so quickly? That question takes Debby back to the discovery that started the entire nightmare. Earlier that day, she had been searching through household paperwork when she found a group of documents and handwritten notes tucked inside a folder she did not recognize. Nothing on the first page screamed betrayal, and Debby almost placed everything back without looking further. But then several words caught her attention because they involved immigration timelines, residency questions, possible changes after marriage, and what could happen if a relationship ended during different stages of the process. For somebody trying to build a life in another country, understanding immigration rules is not automatically suspicious, and Debby knows that. Which is why she initially tries to convince herself that Mido was simply educating himself about a complicated system. Then she notices the date. Some of the notes appear to have been written weeks earlier, long before the latest tension between them became serious enough for Debby to imagine that either person might leave. That detail changes everything, because it means Mido was asking questions about what happened after separation at a time when he was still telling Debby their future was secure. She starts reading more carefully and realizes that many of the questions are not centered on how the two of them could strengthen their life together, but on what options could remain available if their relationship changed. Debby feels a knot forming in her stomach because she suddenly remembers conversations that seemed harmless when they happened. Mido had asked what would happen if somebody's marriage ended after reaching a certain point in the immigration process, whether residency could continue independently under specific circumstances, and how long different applications might take. At the time, Debby heard those questions through the ears of a woman who trusted him, so she interpreted them as anxiety from somebody trying to understand an unfamiliar system. Now she is hearing those same questions through suspicion, and their meaning feels completely different. This becomes the first major emotional turn for Debby because she is no longer simply worried that Mido might leave her. She begins wondering whether she has misunderstood his priorities for much longer than she realized. Every time Mido talked excitedly about America, did Debby assume he was talking about their shared future when he was actually focused on his own future? Every time he discussed sacrifice, did she automatically connect those sacrifices to their relationship even when Mido may have been talking about opportunities he wanted for himself? The more she thinks about it, the more she realizes how easily two people can use the same words while imagining completely different destinations. Still, Debby does not want to accuse him without hearing his explanation, so she decides to confront him directly rather than building an entire case inside her own head. She plans to place the paperwork in front of Mido and ask him why he had been researching these questions, why some of the dates go back so far, and why none of those conversations included her when their relationship was supposedly the foundation of his life in America. She wants to watch his reaction because she believes the reaction may tell her more than the pages ever could. What she never expects is that Mido will be gone before that conversation happens. When Debby finally sees the message he left, she reads it again and again, because it is painfully vague. Mido says he cannot keep doing this and asks Debby not to look for him. But there is no explanation of where he went, no acknowledgement of the paperwork she discovered, no attempt to defend himself, and no promise that he will return after cooling down. The message sounds final without actually explaining what is ending, and that ambiguity makes Debby even more suspicious. She begins wondering whether Mido somehow knew she had found the folder. That possibility creates an entirely new problem, because if Mido realized Debby was getting close to asking questions about his immigration research, his disappearance suddenly looks less like a breakup and more like avoidance. Running away does not prove that the documents meant what Debby fears they meant, but it removes the easiest path Mido had to clearing his name. If everything had a harmless explanation, Debby cannot understand why he would choose silence at the exact moment when silence was guaranteed to make everything look worse. Then something else begins bothering her. Mido had been acting differently before Debby found the papers. For several weeks, he had become more protective of his phone, although not enough for Debby to accuse him of hiding anything. He would sometimes tilt the screen away when messages arrived, then explain that he was dealing with family matters or private conversations. On another day, he disappeared for several hours and returned with an explanation that sounded ordinary enough that Debby never pushed him. There was also one strangely specific conversation about travel in which Mido asked which airport would be easiest if somebody needed to leave quickly, but he laughed afterward and made it sound like nothing more than curiosity. At the time, none of those moments carried enough weight to become a real problem. Now they begin lining up. Debby writes down the dates because she needs to know whether she is allowing emotion to distort the timeline. She compares the handwritten notes from the folder with the days Mido behaved unusually, then notices something that immediately makes her stomach drop. One of Mido's unexplained absences happened shortly after a date written beside his immigration research, and that absence occurred well before Debby found anything. That means Mido could not have been preparing to leave because Debby confronted him. Debby had not confronted him yet. The possibility now enters her mind that Mido was already building an exit strategy while behaving as though everything between them was normal. That thought cuts deeper than the empty closet, because a sudden breakup can be chaotic, irrational, and emotional, but secretly preparing for one requires repeated decisions. Mido would have needed to think about where he might go, what he would need, which documents mattered, how quickly he could leave, and how much Debby should know. If those preparations actually started weeks earlier, then every normal dinner and every future conversation during that period becomes painful for Debby to remember, because Mido may have been mentally living in two different realities. Debby remembers one night when she directly asked whether something was bothering him because he seemed distracted. Mido reassured her that she was overthinking things and told her they simply needed to stop creating problems where none existed. She accepted that reassurance because she wanted peace more than another argument. But now those words feel almost cruel. If Mido was already preparing for the possibility of leaving, then he was not merely keeping his worries private. He was allowing Debby to believe the relationship was more stable than he apparently believed it was. Her fear turns into anger. Yet even that anger cannot answer the biggest contradiction in the story. If Mido's secret goal was simply to remain in America, why would he suddenly flee? Debby keeps returning to that question because it does not fit the simplest version of what she originally feared. Someone focused entirely on protecting an immigration future would normally want stability, not a dramatic disappearance that could create more uncertainty. That means Debby has to consider several different possibilities, and none of them gives her peace. Maybe Mido genuinely loved her while also becoming obsessed with securing his own future, and he privately researched every possible outcome because he feared losing both Debby and America at the same time. Maybe he believed their relationship was already dying and began planning for that reality without having the courage to admit it. Or maybe he knew that Debby was about to ask questions he could not answer without revealing something he had deliberately hidden from her. The mystery becomes less about one piece of immigration paperwork and more about why Mido believed disappearing was safer than explaining himself. Then Debby finds the browser history. She is using a shared computer to check whether Mido left any clue about his destination when she notices searches for flights, travel routes, airport schedules, and departure options. At first, she assumes the searches were made after their most recent disagreement, which could have supported the idea that Mido simply became emotional and started thinking about leaving. Then she checks the timestamps. Several searches were made days earlier. One was made late at night, while Debby remembers being asleep beside him. That single detail changes the entire emotional temperature of what she is seeing, because it means Mido may have been sitting only a few feet away from her, quietly researching how to leave, while Debby believed the man beside her was still committed to solving their problems. The image becomes impossible for her to shake, because there is something uniquely painful about realizing that a major decision may have been forming right beside you, while you had no idea there was even a decision being made. Debby keeps scrolling and finds searches connected to multiple destinations, which makes the situation even more confusing. There is no simple answer telling her exactly where Mido intended to go, and she cannot even tell whether he purchased a ticket from the browser history alone. What she can see is that travel had clearly been on his mind before the confrontation that never happened. Now the theory shifts again. Maybe Mido did not run because Debby discovered the paperwork. Maybe he had already decided that leaving was one of his options, and Debby's discovery simply happened at almost exactly the same time. That possibility makes Debby question whether she was ever as close to understanding Mido as she believed. She starts replaying his behavior during those final weeks, noticing how many moments now seem to contain two possible meanings. When Mido became unusually quiet, Debby thought he was tired, but perhaps he was worried about the decision he was making. When he started asking more questions about his future, she thought he was becoming responsible, but perhaps he was separating his future from hers. When he seemed emotional about everything he had sacrificed, Debby thought he meant the sacrifices he had made for love, but maybe love was only one piece of a much larger dream. Then she remembers a conversation that suddenly feels more important than any page she found. Mido had told her that he could not allow everything he had worked for to disappear, and Debby responded by reassuring him that their relationship would survive whatever pressure they were facing. Mido never corrected her, but he also never clearly said that the thing he was terrified of losing was Debby. At the time, that distinction meant nothing. Now it means everything. There is a huge difference between saying, "I cannot lose our life together," and saying, "I cannot lose everything I worked for," because one statement centers the relationship while the other centers an individual goal. Debby begins realizing that she may have spent months filling in emotional blanks with the answers she wanted to hear. That realization becomes more painful, because Debby remembers how fiercely she defended Mido whenever anyone questioned whether America mattered too much to him. She argued that outsiders did not understand their private connection, and that reducing Mido's feelings to immigration was unfair. She wanted people to see him as a complicated person instead of a stereotype, and part of her still believes that is true. This is exactly why she cannot simply decide that every moment with Mido was fake. People can love someone and still behave selfishly. People can care deeply about a relationship while also making backup plans they are afraid to admit. People can be terrified of losing their future and make decisions that destroy the trust of the person they claim to love. That complexity makes Debby's situation worse rather than easier, because she cannot place Mido neatly into one category. If he never cared, then the betrayal is simple. If he did care but still secretly planned his exit, then Debby has to understand how someone could love her while simultaneously preparing to disappear from her life. Then her phone receives a message from a number she does not recognize. The sender claims to know Mido and says Mido had been asking about travel arrangements before his disappearance. Debby's first reaction is suspicion, because she has no idea whether the person is trustworthy, and she refuses to accept a stranger's claims simply because they fit the story she is already afraid of believing. However, the message includes one detail that catches her attention. Because the person mentions a specific time frame, that closely matches the dates in Mido's browser history. Debby replies asking what Mido said. The answer makes the situation even stranger. According to the message, Mido had been talking about needing to make an important decision about his future and had asked whether travel could be arranged quickly if necessary. The sender does not claim Mido confessed to using Debby, and there is no dramatic admission that proves some massive scheme. But that almost makes the information more unsettling, because it fits the quieter pattern Debby is already seeing. Mido had apparently been thinking about leaving before Debby knew he was thinking about leaving. Now Debby's anger gives way to humiliation, because she begins imagining how many people might have known something was wrong while she continued defending the relationship. She wonders whether Mido discussed his doubts with friends while reassuring her at home, whether somebody helped him understand his options, and whether other people knew about his travel plans before the woman he was supposedly building a life with knew anything. Still, Debby desperately wants him to call. She rehearses what she would say if he finally answered. But the speech changes every few minutes. Sometimes she wants to scream and demand to know whether she was only a pathway into America. Sometimes she wants to calmly place every clue in front of him and force him to explain the timeline. Sometimes she wants to hear nothing except one convincing reason why somebody who loved her would disappear this way. The phone stays silent. That silence slowly becomes one of the strongest pieces of emotional evidence against Mido in Debby's mind. Not because silence proves some hidden plan, but because every hour without an explanation allows the suspicious details to take over the story. Mido could potentially explain the immigration research, he could explain the browser searches, and he could explain the missing document. But by refusing to communicate, he leaves Debby alone with the worst possible interpretations of each one. Then Debby finds something she almost misses completely. While going through a pile of old papers, she notices a folded page underneath a stack of receipts. It appears to be a travel confirmation connected to a reservation created before Mido disappeared. Debby checks the date twice, because she assumes she must be reading it incorrectly, but the timing appears to place the reservation before the day she found the immigration folder. The destination becomes almost irrelevant. The date is the real bombshell. If Mido had already made or prepared a travel reservation before Debby planned to confront him, then his disappearance cannot be explained purely as panic after being accused. He had been thinking far enough ahead to investigate transportation and apparently create a possible route out before Debby ever knew there was anything to expose. That does not tell Debby why he planned to leave, but it destroys the comforting idea that everything happened spontaneously. Now the entire timeline begins organizing itself into a sequence she cannot ignore. First came Mido's questions about immigration and what could happen if a relationship ended. Then came the private notes. Then came the strange absences and unusual phone behavior. Then came the flight searches. Then came the reservation. Only after all of that did Debby discover the paperwork. And only after Debby was preparing to confront him did Mido vanish. From her point of view, she may not have caused the disappearance at all. She may have accidentally discovered it shortly before it happened. That thought becomes the deepest betrayal in the entire story, because Debby had believed she was uncovering Mido's possible plan to secure his American future. But she now has to consider that she may actually have uncovered a plan that was already preparing for a future without her. Yet one crucial question remains unresolved. When did that plan begin? If Mido entered the relationship already thinking about immigration as the ultimate goal, then everything Debby believed about their romance would become painfully questionable. Every affectionate moment, every promise, every sacrifice, and every discussion about the future would need to be re-examined through the possibility that Mido wanted something beyond the relationship from the very beginning. However, if the planning started only after their relationship became unstable, then the story changes completely. Mido may have genuinely loved Debby, become frightened as their problems grew, and secretly prepared a backup plan because he believed admitting those fears would destroy whatever connection they still had. Neither possibility excuses the secrecy, but they make Mido two very different men. That is why Debby finds herself unable to decide whether she feels more furious or heartbroken. Anger tells her that someone who loved her would never have researched an escape behind her back, while heartbreak reminds her that people sometimes make cowardly decisions precisely because they are afraid of confronting someone they still care about. Then Debby receives one final message. This time it comes from Mido. There is no location, no detailed confession, and no explanation of the document. Mido writes that Debby has already decided what she believes about him, and says there is nothing he can say that will change her mind. He claims he needed to leave because the relationship had become impossible for him, and insists that she does not understand everything he was dealing with. For Debby, those words are almost worse than silence, because they acknowledge the collapse without answering any of the questions that caused it. She replies with one simple demand: explain the dates. Mido does not answer. Debby asks why the travel searches happened before she discovered anything. No answer. She asks why he researched what could happen after separation while telling her their relationship was secure. Again, nothing. Now Debby understands that the biggest issue may no longer be whether every suspicion she has about Mido is correct. The biggest issue is that trust has been damaged so badly that even an innocent explanation would have to overcome weeks of secrecy, unanswered questions, and a departure that appears to have been prepared without her knowledge. She sits alone looking at the paperwork and realizes how completely the balance of power has changed. Earlier, Debby feared that confronting Mido might end their relationship, but now the relationship may already be over, and Debby is simply trying to understand when the ending truly began. Was it the moment she found the folder? Was it the night Mido searched for flights while she slept? Was it the day he first researched his options if the marriage failed? Or did something happen much earlier that Debby still does not know about? The most painful possibility is that there may not be one dramatic moment when Mido chose America over Debby. His priorities may have shifted slowly enough that even Mido could convince himself he was doing nothing wrong. Maybe each private search felt harmless, each hidden note seemed practical, and each backup plan felt like protection rather than betrayal, until Debby suddenly looked at all of those pieces together and saw a future being constructed without her. That possibility is what makes the story so twisted, because the green card question may not have a simple answer. Mido may not have viewed Debby only as a ticket into America, yet he could still have become so focused on protecting his American dream that Debby stopped being the center of that dream. For Debby, the difference may no longer matter. She gave Mido trust, defended his intentions, and believed that whatever problems they faced would be discussed openly. Instead, she discovers immigration research she knew nothing about, travel planning that appears to predate their final crisis, and a disappearing act that leaves her questioning everything. Mido may eventually return with an explanation that changes part of the story. But there is one thing he cannot easily erase. Debby was preparing to ask him whether he had secretly planned a life without her, and before she could ask, he was already gone. That timing will always haunt her. Because if Mido's immigration questions were completely innocent, why hide them from the woman whose relationship supposedly made those questions relevant? If the travel planning had nothing to do with leaving Debby, why did the searches begin before she discovered anything? If Mido simply panicked after their relationship collapsed, why does his departure appear to have been prepared well before the final confrontation? And most importantly, if Debby was truly part of the future Mido wanted so badly, why do so many of his private plans appear to work even after removing her from the picture? Debby originally believed the worst discovery would be learning that Mido had a secret green card plan. Instead, she may have discovered something much more devastating. Mido had been preparing for a future in which America still mattered, his plans still mattered, his freedom still mattered. But Debby no longer had to be there. Now only Mido knows whether he disappeared because Debby completely misunderstood him, because he was terrified of losing everything he had worked toward, or because she finally got close enough to a truth he never intended to explain. And until he answers the question he keeps avoiding, Debby is left with one brutal possibility she cannot shake. Maybe Mido did not suddenly flee after his plan was exposed, because maybe he had already decided to run long before Debby realized there was a plan at all. This story is fictional, and created for entertainment only.